And we're live. And it's very early Sunday morning here, so I'm still half asleep. But thanks for joining me, guys. This should be a very interesting discussion.
Thank
I'm
you.
joined
Thank you
by,
very much for having me. Yeah.
I'm joined by a very sick Bunny Blackwell
Uh,
and Diane Ofilli. So, do you guys want to maybe introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about yourselves in case people watching don't know who you are? Should we start with you, Bunny?
oh, certainly. I'm Bunny Blackwell here on YouTube. I occasionally make videos on my highly neglected channel because it takes me forever to make videos and I'm quite busy in my real life. But I tend to take what I attempt is an objective and critical view of things that are taken for granted. I also am pleased to be a regular featured guest on Honey Badger Radio.
Yep. Do you want to tell us a bit about what you do at university?
Oh, I'm just a wee student. I'm studying forensic medicine. So I'm in STEM, and I've actually been thinking about changing the course of how many more years I'm going to be spending at school because being part of the men's rights activism circles, as I'm slowly becoming more exposed to them, I think I may want to spend less time at school so I can have more time to put into real world activism and advocacy. So I'm still going to pursue my degree, of course, but I may not go as far as I had thought because I want to leave time for the work that I'm starting to do here. I I've had so many people contact me and reach out to me with their stories and how hearing from other people who are willing to ask questions that maybe are uncomfortable to ask and how it's helped them. I think it's good work. And my focus is not on money or status or fame. I really just want to do good work. And I know that sounds like a corny Hallmark card, but you don't get into medicine if you don't want to do good work. And I think this is just as important as anything else that I could be doing. So yeah, it's kind of changing. It's changing my trajectory a bit, and it's been very eye-opening. I may make a video on that at some point, but yeah. So forensic medicine for now, though.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't
Mm.
know that you were considering spending more time doing real life activism.
Well, I can't keep up with what's on my plate right now. And I have so many opportunities to go here and go there and speak with this person and investigate this and volunteer here. And I'm really having difficulty juggling my studies and my work and everything else. And something has to give. And if I shave a few years off my school, the only thing it's really going to affect me in terms of is letters after my name and the money I make. But it will free up so much time to balance what I'm doing in, my field with what I'm doing in the world. So, yeah, and I think that I'm finding it very rewarding. I'm finding the people I'm meeting and the opportunities that I'm having to listen to people who might never have the opportunity. I might never have the opportunity to hear their stories is extremely rewarding for me on a level that I don't think any job could necessarily touch. So yeah, it's changing. It's this whole YouTube thing is changing my brain.
Well,
So
that's interesting.
mm.
We've infected you.
It's funny though because my viewpoints have not changed much at all. It's more the heart going into it. Before I was approaching it very academically and almost clinically, but the more people I hear from and their personal stories, the more it is becoming a human endeavor. And that brings me balance as well because I tend to view the world in very black and white clinical terms, but there's this human injection right now of of empathy that I'm experiencing, and it's very eye opening.
Well, that's interesting. Diane, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm an English woman, born and bred Londoner. I am very much a feminist, have been since a child before I even knew what that word even meant. I would say that, well, I write very often on gender, and I would say that I'm somewhat sympathetic to certain, shall we say, raised by the men's rights, although it's not something that I very align with.
I think you were cutting out a little bit there, Diane. You want to
Okay.
repeat that last bit?
Yeah, I'd say that I'm sympathetic to certain issues raised by the men's rights movement, although it's not something that I directly align with. It's something that I've touched on throughout my years of feminist activism and my writing. For example, I interviewed a sex worker whose profession led to her becoming a men's rights activist.
Yeah, our chat last time, you were definitely very open-minded towards the men's rights movement. The I guess the one thing we kind of disagreed on, though, was patriarchy theory and the question whether women are oppressed in the Western world. And for the sake of this conversation, I just want to keep it in the West. I don't want to touch the Middle East for this conversation.
Wise man, Bane, wise
Yes,
man.
that's a whole nother talk for another time. But so you, I guess that's the topic of today. You believe we live in a patriarchy in the West, and women are oppressed in the West?
I do think we live in a patriarchy. I would say it's a relative one. I don't think it's an extreme patriarchy. You know, some may say it's patriarchy light, if you will, but I do think there are still some ways in which certain privileges or opportunities are weighted towards boys and men in a way they're not towards women.
Isn't the counter argument the same, though, that women have some advantages that men don't?
Yes, but it's like I say, it's a relative thing. I mean, for it to be patriarchy means that more of said privileges and opportunities are accessible to men and not women. Now, you can say access is not so much of an issue nowadays because of laws and certain social norms, but I think in certain areas of life, there are still ways in which men are advantaged in a way that women are not or are yet to be fully.
Okay, so that's our first topic. Bunny, you want to jump in on that?
I would like to know what the specifics are, what specific opportunities you feel that are still afforded men that are not afforded to the same degree as women, and why you think that is. That would be a good starting point for me.
Yes, well, there's different ways in which patriarchy manifests itself, different areas. You know, you've got family life, you've got economics, you've got society in general, you've got political and what have you. I would say, in terms of sexuality, that women do still suffer somewhat. I do think that the role of being a passive receptacle for male sexuality is still a problem for women. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily use the term rape culture, not necessarily because in my mind it's an American invention and one that's not necessarily relevant to me as an English feminist, but I do think there are ways in which society panders to male sexuality in a way that's not healthy and that is detrimental to girls and women. You know, we are still expected to behave in certain ways that are just wrong as far as I'm concerned. I mean, fair enough, you do, okay, we don't have the FGM of, say, the in Africa, but I do think there's still our ways. You know, you still have the slut whore paradigm, and even within modern relationships, even with them changing, there are still ways in which men are afforded a certain amount of control that we don't expect women to necessarily have.
Okay. So let's use the women as passive receptacles for men's sexuality. In that case, why, in some places, is rape not, can a woman not rape a man? Because it would seem to me that if your premise was correct, that it would go the other way. But right now, in many places, women cannot legally rape a man. And
Yes.
that's, yeah, so go on.
Well, yes, well, in Britain, that's the case. Legally, a woman cannot be convicted of rape because it's defined by digital or penile penetration. That's why, because simply put, we don't have penises. That's why the law says that we can't rape. As far as I'm concerned, it's still rape. The fact that the intercourse was forcible and initiated by a woman doesn't make it any less a violation than if it were by a man. But according to the legal definition, that is what it's penetration that's the decider.
So to ameliorate this, then, changing the laws to make it more equitable would be a way of actually going against what you're saying, that women are the objects of male aggression and lust. So if we were to change the laws to be more equitable, that would actually be a strike against what you have cited as an example of patriarchy.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
would
that's
be
what
good. Yeah,
it is.
but we're not doing that. And even feminists aren't advocating for this.
Yeah,
Oh,
And
recently,
why should a woman not get the same penalty or punishment for a man as a man for doing the same crime? I would, to be honest, that is exactly why I'm a feminist. If we take the same responsibilities as men, we have to have the same forfeits, the same opportunities, good and bad, as far as I'm concerned.
I agree.
I,
I agree with you
I,
completely.
yeah, I
Sorry.
think everyone here will agree with you on
Yeah.
that, Diane. I was just going to say, recently in Israel, there was a feminist lobby group who stopped the change to the legal definition of rape, which would include women.
Mm.
And their reasoning was that if they allow men to accuse women of rape legally, there will be numerous false accusations against women.
Okay, well, I've not heard of that. I don't understand the logic of that. Um, I don't. I think the forcible aspect is what should matter rather than who
I
is
agree 100%.
penetration. I mean, my issue with rape is the fact that we, of course, condemn it. You know, it's punishable by law. Okay, and women can go to jail for it. But what we do in the West is that we condemn and we condone. Sexual harassment and rape to some extent. You know, you still have that. You see the same excuses of what women wore, or how did she or didn't she fight them off. We do still say, well, men are beasts, boys will be boys. We do still use the same excuses that let male perpetrators off the hook. That's my issue. I mean, obviously, you do get female sex offenders, but the fact is, the vast majority of rapists are male. It's an unfortunate fact.
Yeah, it's a bit hard to get accurate numbers though when we don't acknowledge that females can do it.
Yes, but yeah, that is true. But the fact is, I think even if you don't believe the statistics, I would still believe that men rape more often than women because their size gives them an advantage. The fact is, even if women have the same urges to rape, the fact is us overpowering men on a huge scale is
But
just not possible. We
you,
don't
you
have.
are you are making
No,
an assumption. You're making the assumption that all rape is physically forced, as opposed to someone taking advantage of someone when they're drunk, or um, what's the word? Psychologically forcing them into it.
coerced.
Coerced, yeah. Sorry, it's early Sunday morning, so my
It's all
brain's not
good. It's
fully
okay.
working.
I'm full of flu meds, so I'm not going to be any better.
But I
Hey, so
remember
when
hearing a case a little while ago of I think it was like a 19-year-old female babysitter had sex with a 12 or 13-year-old boy, which she was babysitting. And when it went to court, the judge said that she was very immature for her age. And somehow it was the boy's fault because, well, he was a boy. I mean, it was we get that type of thing all the time where female sex offenders are excused, and are given lighter sentences.
It happens all the time here with teachers.
Exactly.
There was just one last month right where I live. And
not just in Canada, but right
yeah.
across America and here as well.
That is true. I mean, you do have the excuse that it's not as damaging, you know, when the victim is male, what have you. But the issue is, especially if you take teachers as an example, is that there are a mixture of reasons, some to do with the case itself and some that are not. Yes, there is the issue of chivalry, the fact that women are seen as nurturers and wouldn't rape. It's only men that would do that because they're evil and they have to conquer things, including women's bodies. But then there are legitimate reasons. In some cases, if you take, say, male teachers and female teachers who sleep with students, male teachers are known to be far more likely to blame the student. They're also far less likely to admit to their crime straight away, and they're also far more likely to have more than one victim.
Sorry to interrupt, Bunny, but I don't know about that, having heard lots of cases. I've heard of female teachers running away with 13-year-olds to Mexico. In one case, she left her young child behind to run away with this guy, and she basically blamed him, saying that, you know, he was such a man. He was 13. She was in her late 20s.
Mary Kay Letourneau made the same excuse as well about her people. He was 12, but he was already a man. He was 5'8". But yeah, I mean, that is wrong. But the fact is, for me, the problem is that if you take male sex offenders with female female victims, that is far, far, far more common. And the fact is, culture, we have certain cultural norms that encourage it or make it easier for it to happen. As far as I'm concerned, we facilitate it in certain ways that are wrong, as well as throwing the weight of the law and disapproval at it.
I want to go back a bit. I didn't want to interrupt you two, but to go back, Diane, did you say that it's less damaging for men? That rape is less?
It ought to be less damaging when the victim is a boy, which is completely wrong.
Okay, although, I wanted to clarify that. Yeah.
You know, obviously a boy victim is not going to get pregnant. Penetration has less potential for physical injury. And again, a female perpetrator is less likely to be able to use her size to overpower him.
Just on the pregnancy thing, I have heard of cases where a underage boy has, you know, had sex with an older woman or teacher or whatever, and got her pregnant and been responsible for the child for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
There was a case where I think he was 15 or something like that. He was, let's face it, he was raped by an older woman, and unbeknownst to him, she became pregnant, and it was something like 6 years later, she started chasing him for child support for a child he didn't even know he had. So, you know, there's that aspect as well.
Yeah, that is wrong. But then at the same time, you do see cases of underage fathers not being able to have any responsibility or say over their baby's welfare. You know, their child is automatically given up for adoption because of their age. I mean, that, I think the, you know, pursuit of child support in that case is ridiculous. I don't see why the law would allow such a thing, although I have heard of it. But when I said pregnancy, I meant that, well, obviously a teenage boy isn't going to get pregnant.
No, I know, but there is that other aspect that he could get someone pregnant.
Yeah,
and we are specifically talking about young men who are victims of sexual assault. So let's just remind people who may have just tuned in, we're not talking about your average teenage boy. We're talking about victims of sexual assault.
Yeah, I mean, that's a statutory right. I mean, the issue is talking about injury is that with girls, which is why people are concerned, people are generally more concerned about female victims, because obviously pregnancy, especially in a body that isn't fully developed, can be catastrophic, not just for a girl's chances, you know, educational and employment, but even just to her body. I mean, you look, okay, you didn't want to talk about developing world, but you see girls having fistulas or even being paralyzed by pregnancy because of how it's crushed their immature spines and pelvises. The fact is that sexually, there is more impact potentially for the girl in that instance.
Just to go back to what you were saying, Diane, about you made the statement that male teachers are more likely to blame the students. I will contest that. I have watched an awful lot of interviews with women who have been accused or even convicted of these crimes, and they do the exact same thing. They blame and deflect and say, well, he wanted it. He chased me. He was flirting with me. And I think an abuser is an abuser, and they're going to use the same lines.
Yes, that's true, but then there are certain social norms which are actually much wider between men and women, which are applied to cases of statutory rape, which is that as a woman, it's your job to take a man's abuse, or even not so much abuse, but you should gratefully accept a man's attention. I mean, you look at street harassment. I mean, well, you know, we're supposedly, a lot of the time, supposed to be flattered that a man is shouting at us or just being rude to us, just to, you know, when demonstrating his attraction to us.
You don't think there's a flip side to that, that men are meant to be accommodating to women in many ways? I remember sitting in a pub one afternoon with a close friend. We hadn't seen each other for a while. We were catching up, and there was this extremely drunk young woman who staggered over to the table and asked if she could sit down. And I said, "No, I'm here to chat to my friend." And the look on her face, it was as if it was the first time someone had ever said no to her. There was just that expectation that she should be able to sit down and dominate the conversation with these two strangers.
But might that not have been more to do with her being drunk rather than her actual belief? You know, what is she like when she's sober?
Well, yeah, to be honest, the look on my friend's face was exactly the same. The fact that I'd actually said no and not said yes. I think most men would have said yes.
But why? To be chivalrous, or because it's you know, it's a good chance for a lay?
Maybe a combination of all those things. I don't think a lot of men say no to women in a lot of situations where they should.
That is an issue. That actually brings to another point. You know that Pedro, that men, you know, men are the sexual initiators, but then also they can't necessarily say no to sex. They must take up every opportunity possible for it, which again would in part probably explain a lot of sexual aggression. You know, that it's partly certain expectations we place on men that they have to pursue it, even if they don't necessarily want it at that particular time or are minded. It's something they must be ready for whenever. A woman is an opportunity rather than necessarily something they go for with their actual intent only.
I find it interesting that you've parsed it when a woman approaches Bain's table. You know, was it chivalry or were you just looking for a lay? But when a man approaches a woman, she feels compelled to accept the attention, when in reality, neither party is compelled to accept the attention. And both parties, even by the way that you have parsed it, have an equal degree of compulsion to respond in a certain way. So why is it one way for women and one way for men?
Well, no, well, I can't speak to that situation if the woman was drunk, and I think that may have had a lot to do with her entitled attitude. But my point is that when I've spoken to women about, you know, oh, someone shouted at me, or they made some rude comments, like, oh, well, you should be flattered. It's like, well, no. I didn't ask someone to say I was sexy or had nice tits. I didn't ask for their opinion. You know, there is that thing of, well, it is aggression and it's wrong that a man should do it. But then at the same time, that's what we live for as women, to be attractive to men. So you should be pleased to have that sign of it, even if it's delivered in such a monstrously aggressive way.
I do hope you're not speaking for all women, because this certainly does not apply to me.
That's what they said to me. Oh, well, you should be flattered. Oh, well, you should dress in, you know, you should show off more of this and more of that, because there'll be men there and, you know, they'll be looking. You've got to show off what you have. That's my own experience, that not automatically being grateful for that attention. And sometimes
Can I just bring up the point about the alcohol? You said that maybe it was more the fact that she was drunk, and in my experience, drunk women are more entitled or act more entitled, but don't also drunk men. So if a drunk man approaches a woman at a bar and is aggressive or whatever, can't we just blame alcohol in that case, or can we only blame alcohol when women do it?
No, I think, well, you blame the person that's drunk it because it doesn't pour itself down people's throats. Well, I was speaking about sexual harassment generally, you know, when you were out in the street or by men and sometimes even boys who obviously by virtue of their age are not likely to be drunk or to have drunk any alcohol at all. I mean,
that's a fair point. But I have to ask, just from my perspective, I have not seen much street harassment in my life. And speaking to the women I know locally, they haven't either. So maybe it's a local thing. But have either of you been sexually harassed in the street or catcalls? Is it a common thing in your area? Or
I was actually followed last week by a man. He kept shouting at me, I told him to leave me alone. And he said, okay, and then he did. I have been catcalled in the past. I've had, not even in the street, even, you know, elsewhere. Like, I remember being at a sports centre in my school and a male member of staff who was hired by my school cornered me and tried to grape my breasts. That was when I was 13. I've had people shout out things, you know, like I remember once these two 10-year-old boys shouted that they could see my nipples through my top, which was bollocks, but it was clearly meant to, you know, embarrass me. Yeah, I've had a few incidences of it.
what about you, Bunny?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by harassment, because, of course, I've had people make comments. I've had people catcall me. I've had people be idiots to me. But I don't know. I've never felt harassed. I've never felt in danger. I think probably the most egregious one. Oh, I get mistaken for a prostitute a lot. Or I used to anyway when I was younger. But I never took offense to it. It was just more like, well, no, but okay. Thank you. It didn't bother me. It wasn't gross or anything. But the most egregious thing I've ever had happen to me, I think, and I say egregious relatively, I'm not scarred by it. I had an extremely drunken young flip of a man put his hand down my dress. And I reacted quite instinctively. I put him in a wrist lock and put him down. And then everybody got involved. But it was very quick that way. I certainly didn't feel in danger. That's how I deal with things. I don't tend to feel afraid that way. I don't know. It might help that I'm a very tall and statuesque woman. I don't know. Diane's mentioned the size differential, and between me and men, there isn't so much size differential, and that might have something to do with the fact that I don't get harassed as much. It also may have to do with my perspective on things. I've also been harassed by women, and I've actually found the female harassment more disturbing just because of how dogged it's been. You know, I've been followed by a pack of girls making comments about me. Sorry, go on.
It's funny you said about height because I'm exactly the same. I'm about 6'2" myself, and I found I'm pretty big. Yeah, even though I've been harassed, I'm like you. I haven't necessarily been very intimidated by it because of my size, but I think the reason why I emphasize the whole size thing is that it's what, even if it's not an incentive for a potential female offender, you know, sexual offender, that is often what would put them off in a lot of the time. There also, again, I said about sexual norms. I think another reason why is that there is still this idea that when it comes to sexual relationships, men must be the initiator. You know, women do make the first move, but it's still taken for granted that men are more likely to. And I think that's something that carries over to non-consensual relationships like statutory rape. In fact, I mean, you look at one of the many reasons given for why men are more likely to commit it. It's because girls who are young and teenager are more naive and more passive, and that may be more appealing to a man who wants someone that's accommodating or who's scared of getting a no, because obviously that's something that men who be the initiators have to run the risk of more often when it comes to sexual relationships, that it might be more appealing to, go with someone who's more easily impressed or easily to sway.
Is that potentially a cultural thing, Diane? I'm asking only because I know where I am, I've initiated 99% of my sexual relationships.
But this is what I mean about what some people call like rape culture. But then I think there are certain norms which we take for granted, which are not helpful and which contribute to sexual harassment. I mean, there's lots of reasons why it happens, why, but I really give, like slides and blah, blah, biology. But I do think there are certain ways in which society encourages it, or at least it probably helps it be more prevalent than it otherwise would have been.
But it's not a fait accompli, though. There's no guns to the head forcing people to accept this. This is what I'm saying. I've initiated most of my sexual encounters. Just because it's the society you live in doesn't mean you have to live that way.
But that's exactly my point, is that we've instilled these norms and we can get rid of them, but for some reason we still haven't. Now, the thing is that what makes me angry about it is that people are too obscured by the whole sexual divisiveness issue to look at what the real source of the immorality is in terms of the statutory rape. Now, obviously, okay, you have more male offenders doing it to female victims than women doing it to male. But what makes it wrong is not the sex of either party. It's the fact that it's an adult doing it to a kid. And that's my problem, is that people are they're too blind to the fact that, it's more men doing it or what have you. It's like, what about protecting the children in this case, or the kids? They are the ones who deserve far more concern than anything else. But it seems like that's overlooked.
I couldn't be more with you here.
Yeah.
Sorry,
echo. That's what I think that's what really makes me angry, or even the situation me being 13. Okay, I wasn't as intimidated because I was already tall for my age and I was able to square off with him. I was able to look him square in the eye and stand up to him. But the fact is, most kids or girls do not have that luxury, and it's that case of I wasn't angry that it happened to me because I was a girl. I was angry because at 13 no one should have to fend off the sexual advances of an adult. Why can't you just hang on to that little bit of innocence that you have left? That is where my anger lies, quite frankly.
I think we a bit of echo. I think we agree with you, but sorry, I'm keep on getting echo. It's distracting.
Where it's coming from. I mean, I've turned off my phone and my iPad. I don't have a radio or anything, or nearby, so I don't know where it's coming.
It's not on my end. Oh, there we go. It's gone.
Yep. So anyway, what was I going to say? Oh yeah. Well, we're talking about statutory rape, but I think we need to also consider the statistics for female on male rape as adults. If you look at the CDC figures for forced to penetrate, they're extremely high, but we don't consider that rape, even though a man has been coerced into sex that he didn't want.
Yeah, I think again, I hate to say, but I think the sizing. People say, well, a boy can easily fight off a grown woman. It's similar to, let's say, when men being battered by their wives. They say, well, if a man hit the wife back, the fighting would stop. Even though, of course, men often don't do that, and they shouldn't have to be put in that position. It's that thing of, well, we don't have to necessarily worry so much about men in that position or the boys, because they can fight off their abuser, or they're more likely to be able to fight off their abuser.
But physical size isn't really that important if you're being coerced, though, is it? I mean, we're talking coercion, so it's not necessarily a physical thing. It's a psychological thing.
Yes, that's the thing. But yeah, I mean, if you're talking about psychologically forcing somebody to rape, then that's the thing, is that how do you establish that legally? I think that's part of the issue why it's so hard to do so. I mean, rape is, if it's physical, forcible penetration, part of the reason I think it's easier is that there's more obvious signs of injury, that people can use. They can present in court, like say vaginal tearing or what have you. There's evidence that trauma has happened, that violence has happened. But if you're psychologically forcing somebody, especially if the victim shows signs of arousal, which is not their choice at all and doesn't reflect whether they consented or not, then it's harder to establish or to even gather the evidence to prove that the sex was not lawful and it wasn't consented to. I think that's a real issue of psychological, right, if I can call it that.
Bunny, you want to jump in?
Oh, sorry, I wanted to let you finish because I'm picking up on a thread from earlier from something that Diane had said. Diane, earlier we were talking about how when especially young women are raped or abused, there's that extra body horror factor of pregnancy. And we're now skipping forward into adult and non-consensual sex, and we have paternity fraud, where a woman is effectively inflicting a pregnancy upon a man. But we don't have that same kind of revulsion for what a woman has done. Now, of course, a pregnancy will not affect his body, but it will affect him for a long time, and it will affect him in significant ways. And because I totally get the visceral horror of a 13-year-old being knocked up by her father. That is so visceral and horrible and awful. But then you have someone deliberately getting a man to a state where she can have his way with him, which does happen. It does happen. And he, even if he wore a condom, there are ways around that. There have been many cases of women sabotaging birth control because they want that baby by that man. And I'm not about to cry. I have the flu, for people just tuning in. I'm not about to cry. I'm just sick. Anyway, and there isn't that same kind of horror. I've watched these threads unfold on Twitter and other forums where, well, he's just going to have to suck it up. So where does that come from? Because you put things very much in terms of this is what we've been taught. This is what we've been inculcated into. Where does this come in that a woman can entrap a man into pregnancy and get little to no sympathy, even if he's been forced or tricked?
I think parts of it, well, people have slagged off, insulted or blamed feminists for it. I think that partly is, but I think there's lots of reasons why people do. I mean, a lot of people have said, well, it's if you didn't use protection, if you didn't use condoms, then it's the man's fault. That it's really your responsibility to yourself to prevent pregnancy. You shouldn't just leave it to your partner. I think that given that this issue, you tend to see a lot of it in American online media, I think it's not even just feminism. I think a lot of it is actually from conservatism of both a social and fiscal nature. It's that thing of a man should pay for his child as opposed to the taxpayer having to fund welfare. Why should, my hard-earned money go towards paying for a child who's the product of his or her parents' choice to have sex?
To be fair, I've heard both feminist and the far right conservatives use the same type of arguments against men's rights issues, including this one. So it's strange that they're strange bedfellows when it comes to men's rights issues, and I think this is an example of one. So
I think America is it's taken for granted that it has a culture of the individual, and I think a lot of it is from an economic perspective. I mean, if you look at, say, conservative writers like who has criticised feminism, she has said that how it's led to the culture of fatherlessness. I think it's partly because people are scared of it. People are scared of what fatherlessness is doing to boys, the link to criminality and poverty and poor educational things, especially if you look at, say, it's affecting the African American community, and people are scared that that pattern will be extrapolated to society as a whole if we allow such wanton fatherlessness to happen.
But if a woman gets pregnant and she doesn't want the child, she can have an abortion, or if she doesn't want an abortion, she can give the child away due to the baby Moses laws in America, but we don't give a man that option. What we hear is, well, he should have kept his dick in his pants.
Yeah.
So a woman, if she gets pregnant, we give her every opportunity to give up parenthood if she wants, even after the child is born, right? But a man, well, it's his responsibility, even if it was an accident, and he just has to deal with it. And in the man's case, we hear, but what about the child? We have to think of the child. But we don't hear that when it's the mother's case. For some reason, we put the mother ahead of the child, her rights or her choice.
Some people don't. Well, some people do. I don't necessarily do, because I'm pro-choice, but I don't necessarily agree with all of the reasons a woman may have an abortion. Quite frankly, I think some reasons are more justifiable than others. I think it's mainly sympathy because women have to bear the pregnancy. It's not just about, the care afterwards that a mothers are more likely to have to take on.
But we give mothers that choice even after they give birth. Like, for example, in America, we have the baby Moses laws where they can just leave a child at their local fire station.
But I think it's partly people give mothers or the pregnant women some credit for at least carrying the baby to term, as though she were still deliberating whether she can or can't look after the child. I think that's why. I think it's because it's so physically easy for a man to remove himself from that situation to do a so-called conceive and leave. I think that's partly why people have less sympathy for men, because they're less physically involved from the very start.
Yeah, but financially they can be devastated for the next 20 years. There are men who have gone to jail because they can't afford to pay child support.
I know that men have had their wages garnished, but I would say the responsibility is on both partners to use contraception if they don't want a baby to happen. I'd say if a man used contraception, he used condoms and it still happened, then fair enough, walk away. But then at the same time, the problem is that if you were, say, in a court of law, say, trying to argue as a man why you shouldn't have to pay child support, how would you prove that you use condoms?
And the problem is, this is a good point. The problem is right now he can't just walk away. And because there is no way at this point to prove it. And even if you were to sign contracts and have affidavits, they would be thrown out, in my opinion, because of female bodily autonomy and the current child support mandates. So every time a man has sex with a woman, unless he has had the snip, which at this point I think is becoming more and more of an option for men at younger ages, simply to avoid this, which is unfortunate because I think dads should have babies. I like babies. I like good people having babies and raising them well. But right now, you're taking your life in your hands every time you do it, and you have no recourse. And I'm not a man, obviously. At least I hope it's obvious. But this isn't a gamble I would want to take. I would be going for a snip as quickly as possible. And yeah, I think that's sad. I think that's sad, though, because it's not an honor system, is it?
I understand that sentiment. I would say to men who fear this to use a condom. I'd say worst case scenario is that if you have gotten someone to stay with, leave the woman behind, but not the child. I'd say be involved in their life, even if you're not going to pay them money. In fact, that's one thing I don't care for about father involvement, is that when people talk about absent fathers, it's all about, well, they haven't paid child support, but then, well, in this day and age of equality, fathers can do and should do so much more. You talk about how single mothers having to work to pay for children, they're all on their own. Well, why can't the man, say, take over a couple of days per week while the mother can work?
Assuming she lets him. That's the problem. Assuming she lets him.
Yeah, that's true. But then a lot of the time, I think part of the reason, you could argue that a lot of the time single motherhood is a corruption of the traditional notion that childcare is a mother's responsibility and not a father's. I mean, part of the reason why you have a lot of it is because, well, if a man doesn't have a job, he's more likely to leave the house because, like, well, I have no role in the house. If I can't pay and I don't have a job, then there's no point me being here. There's a certain like, obsolescence to the male presence in the home if he can't pay. But it's like, well, a father can do so much more than just pay. You know, he can offer so much more than just money. And that's, again, one of the things I don't care for about patriarchy is that it's created really rigid gender roles that people stick to, even when it flies in the face of logic or the survival of the family.
But
The
to
health.
interrupt for a
Sorry.
second, I was just going to say now the National Organization for Women in America, the largest feminist organization in America, and I think maybe the world, is actually supporting those gender roles. They've actually been fighting against shared parenting bills for, I think, 16 years now. So we have the largest feminist organization, at least in America, possibly the world, supporting patriarchy gender roles because it benefits mothers.
True, but then you also have that doesn't really. I mean, that is not good. But then it's something that I don't really think concerns me. I don't really think that it will. I don't see it taking off, especially in this day and age where co-parenting is seen as a more realistic option for people having kids nowadays. Especially, you know, lower rates of marriage and more.
But they've been successful in stopping shared parenting bills from going through.
Yeah, but have what they've succeeded in doing so.
As far as I know, yeah.
Yes, correct.
Well, okay, so what? So, but then.
So, but our point, the men's rights movement basically think that when two people get divorced, it should start with the 50-50 shared custody. And if someone wants less time with their child, then that can be negotiated. I think that would be a fair starting point, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Whereas
I think it's. Well, yes, I mean, but then how? Okay, but how would that work? That bill work when there's a co-parenting agreement in place? I mean, that I find quite interesting, especially where you have, say, a gay parents as well. How would that work? I mean, a lot of people do that. You know, if they don't live together but they agree to have a child together and raise them, yeah, raise them together, just not living under the same roof. How would that bill or act come into effect?
well, at the moment, it's the default parent is the mother. What I'm suggesting
yeah.
is the default parents should be both the mother and the father. Now,
Oh, yeah.
if the father, for example, wants less time with the child because I don't know, he's busy with his career or whatever, then he can negotiate down that time. So maybe he wants 20% of the time instead of 50. And the same would go for a working mother who's more interested in her career than being a stay-at-home mum or whatever. But
Yeah, I mean,
the starting point would be equal as opposed to what it is now.
There's still the echoes of the tender years doctrine, though, yeah. So there's still that lean toward things. And what I was going to say, Bain, I was exactly along the same way that you were. I would argue, and I know you will probably disagree, Diane, but this is where I was going. And I don't know, but right now, as I see it, the biggest proponents and enforcers, at least on a legislative level, of these patriarchal gender roles are feminist organizations like NOW, who are pushing for things to remain in these roles, and with women being assumed to have less agency, and with women being assumed to be naturally better nurturers and naturally better caregivers, and an assumption that men are naturally toxic. And I don't see the reinforcement of patriarchy coming from the patriarchy anymore. If it ever did, I don't know. That would take hours, but the people I see reinforcing these gender roles of women as damsels and men as aggressors are feminists. And I'm not counting you here. I'm saying, I think people like NOW, those type of feminists. And speaking with you is so different, because you do tend to drill down to, well, this is the core, this is what's going on. But you are unusual in my experience. So I don't see men wanting these gender roles. So
I would, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I've certainly know of the NOW's, campaign on that behalf, for, women to have primary custody. Um, I, I don't really understand what, I think I don't know. I mean, I suspect it's because it's to do with how motherhood has been sort of demeaned because of, how you do have a lot more campaigns now, for example, Mothers at Home, that's a group, fighting for the recognition of unpaid care and child rearing, for it to be recognized more, even though it's not paid. I think that's partly why. It's because
I can explain why they're supporting it. It's
true.
because they put women's needs and wants before men, basically.
But what you find is that there's feminists who have demonized motherhood because it's been what's held women back, it's why we couldn't work and have economic freedom. But then at the same time, you have feminists who have done the opposite. It's almost as though they're trying to completely counter attack that demonization and say, well, no, it's central to a female identity. How dare it be attacked? We should be able to maintain it as women. That's
to bring it back. To bring it back to sorry to interrupt, but to bring it back to the topic of patriarchy, I've heard both things called patriarchy by feminists. I've heard the fact that mothers are expected to stay at home and look after kids to be part of patriarchy, but at the same time, I've heard feminists say that fathers wanting an equal part of their child's life or wanting custody of their children is also patriarchy because they're stealing the kids away from the mother. So this patriarchy thing I find very interesting because feminists tend to throw it around as a be all end all answer to everything. It's almost like conspiracy theorists throwing around the word Illuminati a lot of the time.
Very good. Excuse me, I have to cough.
I just thought nowadays that would go without saying that kids would be shared 50-50 in the law. That isn't the case, which is ridiculous. But part of the reason why, I think one of the reasons why is that because women are more likely to take time off to look after kids and to have the children, that it's the case of, well, it makes more sense for the woman to take the kids after divorce because the man's just going to carry on working anyway, just as he did before the divorce. He's just going to carry on working and being the breadwinner the way he was, while the marriage was still intact. So why ruin that paradigm, especially in a child's life when they've already going through so much disruption anyway, in their household?
Okay, let's run with that for a second. Let's say that's a reasonable excuse. The flow-on effect is that women are going to spend less time at work, they're going to earn less money, and they're going to fall behind in their careers. The thing is, you can't have everything. If you choose to be a stay-at-home mum, even for a short period of time, then your career is going to suffer. If you want to be a career woman, then you have to give the father an equal opportunity. But what I see feminists saying is that they want to be mums for at least part of the time, but not fall behind at work and earn the same amount of money. And we hear the wage gap nonsense all the time.
There was a feminist.
You can't have everything.
Reference the article about a woman complaining about how hard it is to have to share her kids with her ex. And I was reading it, and I had very little sympathy. I'm like, welcome to what men have been having to do, because you now have to balance a career and taking care of your kids. You wanted equity, here you go, and you can't then complain about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just thought, to be honest, a lot of women would welcome it because it's more free time for them, and of course, it's more free time for them to work and to, accelerate their career opportunities. Well, I know that as a woman, especially as someone who's always been ambitious, I would enjoy that. I would enjoy not having my kids with me all the time, and have it pursued. But then I think it's also to do with what I call martyrhood, which is that, women, there are some mothers who think they've got to do everything. They've got to spend, have everything fine at all cylinders, work, children, be all things to all people in all areas. And that's impossible because all you do is end up spreading yourself thin. At the end of the day, you can't be in two places at once. I think that's what it is, but I personally don't believe in that. I mean, I've always thought that were I to have children, I'm not, you either stay at home or be a part-time mother, or you do the full-time thing and not be there as often. You can't do both. You can't, you can't pursue both sets of, juggling, as it were.
I'd like to make an observation, Diane. I'm hoping you can clarify it a bit. When I listen to you speak, you place a lot of emphasis on external things, like women feel they have to, or we have societal pressures. But at the end of the day, everything is a choice, and we choose how we live our lives. So how do you balance the two?
Well, I do. I mean, I think with the issue with work, in terms of whether you stay at home for your kids or not, I personally consider it a choice. Nowadays, whether we, the professions we go into, full well, before you go into that profession, you know what hours it has, what the ramifications are, and what its prospects are. And you don't have to be a genius to know that if you're doing a job that's, say, 40, 50 hours a week, you may not be around to pick up your kids after school. You may not even be around to make dinner for them. You might tuck them in. There's sacrifices to be made. We make them in certain areas, in other ways we don't. But the reason why I say we feel is that it's dangerous to talk in absolutes, because some things we have no choice in and some things we do, but then it's like decisions in general is that they're a mixture of different things. They're partly free will, but then they're also influenced by certain external influences as well. It's just a matter of measuring to what degree. I mean, I would say the work thing is mostly a choice for women, but again, it's that thing of it's a choice, but it's not a complete one made completely freely. It is influenced by certain social norms or ideas, if you will.
Well, that's an interesting point you bring up, that the fact that women basically have a choice. They can be stay-at-home mums, they can be part-time mums and part-time career, or they can concentrate fully on their career. Yet, generally speaking, men don't have those same choices. So it's a strange type of patriarchy, because it gives women... Sorry?
Well, I think things are somewhat changing now. I mean, you have a lot more...
Very slowly.
...of latte papas, like the Swedish fathers who are very hands-on with their kids and take a lot of time off work for their children. And also... in England now, we now have paid parental leave, and we have had some quite high-profile examples of such. A Conservative MP doing so. That, was a lot of news, because obviously Conservative parties are not associated with equality. So that made a lot of headlines over here, and I think it's something more and more men will be doing. And
I think that's a good thing, but I think it's very slow, and
all progress is slow. I mean, I think a lot of the issues that we have, problems that we have now in terms of misogyny and patriarchy, is that it's not just that there's still some sexism. I think what it is in women is that it's partly where we are in terms of that disadvantage. It's partly due to residual sexism or misogyny. It's a case of, well, we're still playing catch up, and unfortunately, progress is a tortoise. It's not going to happen overnight. It is happening. We've already made a lot. I'd say we're pretty near equality, at least in Britain, but there's still increments to go before we can say, yeah, it's a level playing field.
So you said that we live in a light patriarchy, and that men still have some advantages. So what percentage advantage, disadvantage? It's not obviously not 50-50 in your opinion. So what do you think? It's 55, 45, or 30-70, or what?
What I've been thinking. I would say in Britain, I would say probably 60-40. Or maybe 55, maybe 55-45. I'd say that.
Okay, that's interesting. What do you think, Bunny?
From my perspective here in Canada, I don't believe there are any advantages that men have over women. I think the advantages that could be perceived in terms of societal pressures or societal viewpoints or gender stereotypes, I think they affect men as badly as they affect women. I think if you turn over any aspect of toxic patriarchy, you're going to see toxic responsibility as well for men. And I think it affects them just as badly. I don't think that eradicating gender roles completely is ever going to happen, nor do I think it should. But when you look at things like patriarchy in feminist theory, going back in the vault of my brain as best as I can right now, but it was essentially like a system of social structures and practices in which men dominate and exploit women and something else. I'm going back into the sexual politics way back when I was studying this. And so dominate, oppress, things like that. You flip that over and all of a sudden you have men being responsible for women as well. And you can go through history and you can see, well, here's an aspect where men had power and it looks really unfair. And then you look at the flip side and you see maybe it wasn't so good for him either. So
And disposability too.
Exactly. It wasn't women who were fighting and dying so we could have the glorious civilization that we have now. Our Stotska forever. But right now here in Canada, I don't think there's a single one. In fact, my perspective, of course, as a men's rights, whatever I am, because I don't have a label, I don't have a name tag. Hello, my name is Bunny. I have no name. But I can name some areas where men and boys are being seriously left behind and hard done by and getting the short end of the stick. Whereas as a woman moving about in the world, I cannot name you one where I am held down. And that's part of why I make the things I do. And yeah, but Diane, I think you wanted to say something.
Right, sorry, I was turned for my coughing fit. I think I may have caught what you had actually.
Oh no! Hopefully
flu.
it's not that contagious. You do not want this. No.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to speculate, what situations like in Canada. I'll say the thing about responsibilities is that, yeah, you can say that responsibilities are a burden, but then at the same time, I think where the injustice is not having the opportunity to take on that responsibility if you so wish. I mean, yes, fighting in a war and dying, yeah, it's horrible that people get killed and violence. I don't mean to sound flippant at all, but then on the flip side, you could argue that fighting for a cause and dying for it is a point of honor. There's no getting away from
Or
the fact
is that just a way to trick people into going off and fighting and dying?
Yeah, you can say to trick people, but then why did people sign up for terrorist groups then? They're not necessarily always forced to do it, but they do so because they believe in a cause. I mean, it's funny you say that. I mean, people say, well, women are lucky because they didn't have to fight in wars or armies and what have you. But then women didn't necessarily have the choice. And you can say it's all very cushy, but for some people, especially when conscription is not involved, fighting in a war is, in a way, not even so much a privilege, it's something they want to do. It's something that is honor, it's even something, it's an identity that they want for themselves. I mean, you look at, say, ISIS wives, people say, oh, look at them, they're so coddled, and now they're worried about them having Kalashnikovs and possibly doing suicide bombings. But then they can conveniently forget things like the Beslan siege, which recruited many female terrorists who, did not detonate their bombs, or even the Black Widows of Chechnya, who'd been killing, goodness knows how many people for years beforehand. The fact is, there are women who, given the chance, would have fought for causes, if they'd been given the chance.
But looking at right now, because we can go through history and we can see the balance swing. This is where it was better for women. This is where it was better for men. But we're looking at things right now. I know here in Canada, in our Canadian forces, women can serve in every combat branch. And yet the numbers of women volunteering for this and signing up for this are still vastly lower. And a lot of that to me comes down, I don't think it comes down to the rah chest thumpy rah anymore, because frankly the forces are not glorified here. We can barely get people to wear poppies anymore. There are protests. There's an extreme anti-military sentiment in Canada right now. But I will say, I do think there's some biological realities to some combat branches. We're always going to have fewer women in our infantry due to the demands.
I would say also it's a matter of socialization as well, because being in the army is obviously a very physical thing, and unfortunately there is this association that sport and extreme physicality is still somewhat of a manly thing. I mean, if you look at, for example, in schools, it's actually been studied that there's a direct correlation between a girl's age and her participation in sport, and there's a sharp drop after the age of 16. Why? Because girls are scared that they'll bulk up and look masculine and not attractive to boys. Also, as well, I think people still see the army as embodying certain very masculine qualities, like aggression, that girls are discouraged from displaying. Okay, maybe not so much nowadays, but ones which we still rightly or wrongly, associate with boys or expect of boys and men.
It's interesting because recently in America, they opened up the draft to women as well, finally. And I saw two very different reactions from feminists. One was like, yeah, this is great, it's about time. The other one was, how dare you ask our daughters to go off and die in a war?
I've actually heard the argument that women shouldn't do it because, well, we're more likely to be looking after the children, and how can we leave them behind? That's something that pisses me off, because it's like, well, what about fathers? Haven't fathers? Are you telling me that all the men who died on battlefields, none of them have ever had children? It's ridiculous.
There's an exhibit. This is just a quick side note. We have to put some anecdotal stories in here. In the War Museum in Ottawa here, it's just by the Passchendaele exhibit, there's a tiny little teddy bear that a father made out of just canvas scraps he found in the time, because they got downtime between shelling and stuff. And there was a note attached to it, and it said, "I hope I get to give you this." And the card, of course, said it was delivered posthumously. So I love that they added that aspect of a father sending this to his son. And I completely agree with you. I think if you make the argument that women should not be drafted because they have to care for the children, well, what about the fathers who do too? I can see a lot of abuse coming out of the draft, and women getting pregnant to avoid deployment. That already happens here. It's never talked about, but there's this thing in the military here that magically right before deployment, a contingent of women get knocked up. They choose that moment to have their babies. And, it is what it is.
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, you've had him, like a few years ago, media spotlight on abuse within the military, sexual abuse, and I wonder if there's not concern of sexual abuse that might deter women, especially in a supposedly hostile, male-dominated environment. And also, it's interesting that you say a feminist, because I've actually come across men who've said that how they don't want women to work alongside men in the army because it will distract the men. All the men will be fighting over the women, or they'll turn into white knights who'll be more interested in protecting women because they're women, rather than seeing actual comrades.
As I said earlier, it's interesting when we bring up men's rights issues that feminists and conservatives often make the same type of arguments. I think you just gave us another example of some feminists and some conservatives making the same arguments.
Yeah, but I've heard some men say that, well, they don't want women in the army because they know that if they were fighting alongside a woman, their mindset would be to protect her rather than fighting the enemy.
That's okay. In my experience, that does happen. But
It's a strange type of patriarchy we're living
yeah,
in. Isn't it?
exactly.
Yeah.
Where the women get stuff done for them. That does happen. It's just it's a fact of life. Not all men do this. Not all men. Hashtag. But there is, and it has to be trained out. Actually, it's something that happens in training. You have to stop seeing them as women, and start seeing them as your comrades in arms. And some people are more successful with that than others. My only reticence with women serving in the military, because that can be trained out, that can be. My hesitation comes that women can no longer be treated the same as men. You cannot treat women as meanly in training as you can men, because they complain and they make complaints and you get in trouble and you're called in, and that's so they've now had to reduce their training standards to accommodate the feelings. And if you're going into the army, you got to put your feelings aside to a certain degree, to a pretty big degree actually. And the other thing is the lowering of fitness standards. I mentioned infantry earlier. There are some women who are capable of carrying everything you need to carry, but even at my fittest, I couldn't do it for very long. So
Yeah.
it's there's some realities with that, and we also have the reality of we get our periods, and I can't speak for anyone. Some people just breeze through it, but some women just curl up in a ball and want to be left alone with the heating pad because the pain really is real and it really is crippling, and you can't have that in combat theater. So again, we have to balance the biological realities with equal treatment and not lowering of standards. That's my only concern with women in the military. So
Yeah, I think even in terms of the entrance, the lower rates of women entering, but lower than expected. I think again, as they said that women can't be treated as meanly. You see that happening with teachers. I mean, you have to say. I mean, I was reading an article about why boys are failing at school, and they were saying how it's partly because female teachers don't understand the needs of boys, or they're harsher on boys as a way of as vengeance for the wrongs of men. But at the same time, I think it's not just female teachers that do it. Even male teachers admit to being much harsher with boys. They're more likely to shout at them. They're more likely to be sarcastic, um, or being more critical towards them because they think boys can take it in a way that girls can't.
Yeah,
I see where you're going. Sorry, I want one tiny little thing, Dane, before we get
yeah,
away
you
from
go.
this. I see where you're going with this, Diane. I am very hesitant to compare a classroom to the field, only because in a classroom it's a much more controlled environment. It's less stressful. When
Oh,
you're in
yes.
the field and you're exhausted and you're stressed and you're at the end of your rope and you haven't slept and you haven't eaten more than a meal, sometimes it's someone yelling at you and calling you a piece of shit is the only thing that gets your arse moving. And taking that away, I think you have to be able to tune people up in the military to push them, and we're no longer able to do that. So, but in a classroom, I see where you're going with that.
Yeah, I think. Well, no, I think so. I didn't make myself. I don't think clear enough. My point is that the socialization of girls being taught to see ourselves as being more fragile and less able to meet certain challenges starts
Okay.
that we can carry that over. We bear it into later life. We say we're less willing to go for certain male dominated industries or ones that we think require that, pragmatism and, brutish competitiveness because we think,
But
well,
doesn't
that's not us. If we do have that in us.
doesn't feminism support that in the sense of seeing women as victims and men as perpetrators? I mean, that's what we hear all the time from feminists.
Mm-hmm.
So surely that reinforces the notion that women are fragile. I mean, if a man does something online and gets abuse, then he should just suck it up and take it. But if a woman does something online and gets abuse, well, it's the war on women, and it's because of misogyny and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it seems that a lot of feminists are trying to prevent women from getting any type of criticism, whereas men, well, you can say whatever the fuck you want, no one cares.
Well, no, well, I have seen. Well, I think it depends on the type of man. If it's someone who's seen as baiting it, like Milo Yiannopoulos, I think it's a different case of somebody like that getting abused and say an ordinary fellow in the street. Like I remember there was one of this man who was body shamed for being fat and dancing not very well, and he ended up I think being on Ellen or something, and lots of people wrote Instagram messages, oh, I'll take you out. He got all these, wonderful, rewards and stuff for it. I think the reason why, I think it's just that it's easier to target misogynistic because it's often so obviously misogynistic, threats of rape or, comments about women, about particular body parts. Men have gotten attacked, but I don't know that they necessarily get comments about having their dick chopped off or something. Obviously, they get violent.
They do. In fact, I don't know if you've seen the famous talk show clip in America where there was a group of women sitting around a table. This is like a daytime show, and they're talking about a woman who drugged her husband, tied him to a chair, and cut off his penis because he asked her for a divorce. And they were sitting around laughing about the fact that he got his penis chopped off.
It was chilling.
And the audience, which was I'd have to guess 95% women at least, were all laughing as well. So, a man being brutalized in that way apparently is comedy. And the main culprit was Sharon Osbourne, Ozzy Osbourne's wife.
Yeah.
And she came because there was a lot of outrage. So she came back the next week and did an apology, but she was kind of snickering all the way through the apology.
Yeah, but then how does that pertain to men getting hate mail, though?
Well, it's an example of if something like that was done to a woman, right, it would be an example of misogyny and patriarchy and the war on women and how society hates women, etc., etc. But when it's done to men, it's just like, meh,
I do think that's wrong. I think it's in that case, it's probably seen as vengeance. It's their turn to suffer. Especially as you mentioned it, Sharon Osbourne. I think partly because she's obviously suffered, abuse from her husband. Ozzy famously tried to strangle her. Although I just really hope that woman is in jail. It is wrong to laugh at. I mean, I don't see how it cannot be. I think that's pretty fucked up.
It was pretty fucked up. I actually featured the clip in one of my videos. It was awful. But to loop back around, because I made the statement earlier that I think most of the patriarchal norms are actually coming from the major feminist side, of which, again, I do not count you in that because we were having a discussion. You have your own unique views. But I'm talking about the lobbyists and legislators and the academics and who are really pushing for things to be a certain way and not having these kind of dialogues. But to get back to what I was saying, when you mentioned, Diane, that women and girls are not encouraged to be as competitive, especially in things like sport, but then you hear from, especially here on the YouTube pundit feminist side, you hear that competitiveness is actually toxic masculinity. So,
yeah.
And this blows my brain. It's like, girls, we need you to be more competitive, but boys, when you do it, you're toxic. And as putting myself back in my tiny little youth, I would be looking at that going, well, is it bad or is it good? I don't understand. Should I be doing this? And I have always been extremely competitive again, so I will take you at your word that a lot of girls drop out of sport. I will say it is not so, at least here in my circles. In fact, most of the sort of top girls were all in sports, and they were all the popular cool girls, and that's what you did. It wasn't the era of the cheerleader has long gone. It's now like the floor hockey and lacrosse players, who are volleyball players, but. This is what I mean about enforcing the gender roles. I don't see it coming from the men's rights side. I don't see the enforcement of these gender roles. I see it coming from the feminist side and frankly, as you say, the conservative side. So I just wanted to play on your comment about competition.
Which is funny because often when they write articles about us in the media, they claim that we're conservatives who want to stick to traditional gender roles. It's amazing, really.
Yeah, but there have been some men's rights activists who do, who do promote very traditional gender roles. I mean,
Who?
I remember Rush Reed. You look at Rush Reed.
Hold on. He's not a men's rights activist. He's a pickup artist.
Oh, did
Okay,
we mention Root? Yeah. Oh no, Roosh. Roosh is not.
No,
He's even said he's not a men's rights activist, although
he has
going into
written
political
tons
pension.
of anti-MRA articles for
Yeah,
years, and he's come out numerous times saying that he is not part of the men's rights movement. Yet the media constantly uses him as an example of a leader, which is just crazy. We're always
what leader?
criticizing him.
yeah.
Hey,
Okay, what? So what? You're telling me all men's rights activists are all for total equality? There aren't any that believe that women should be housewives. I mean, if you look at a lot of
none
comments,
that I know of.
yeah, but
I'm
if you
thinking.
of men's rights, not necessarily leaders or writers, you do come across a lot of men who say how we should go back to times when women were subjugated and when women should need to be controlled and
Yeah,
beaten
but
by men.
that goes against the ethics of the goals of the movement. I mean, we don't want men to be trapped into roles of provider protector.
True,
So
but then who call themselves men's rights activists, who
who?
actually want to go back to the no. I'm talking about effectively anonymous men who are not necessarily leaders who say I believe in men's rights activism because it means going back to the
Well, all
50s
right.
women's stand-up movement.
Let me put it this way: I've occasionally come across feminists who are anti-abortion, right? But they're very, very rare. So you couldn't really label the feminist movement as anti-abortion because there may be, 3 or 4 conservative feminists out there. Uh, but it would be fair to say that the majority of the feminist movement is pro-choice. So you
Yeah,
could use the exact same argument with the men's rights movement. There may be, a handful of MRAs out there who do want to go back to the 1950s, but they're extremely rare because they essentially go against the core beliefs of the men's rights movement, which is that the traditional gender roles of men being the provider protector is restrictive.
I will
I mean,
say in. Oh,
if
sorry.
we're in
Go on.
favor of 50-50 parenthood, then that's obviously not going back to the 1950s. If we want to
yeah.
outlaw male circumcision, that's not going back to the 1950s. So, I mean, I see all the time in the media where people claim people are MRAs when they're not, and they have
Mhm.
nothing to do with the movement, and they're going by a stereotype that they've either created in their head or they've come to that conclusion based on other faulty, misleading articles. They're essentially fighting stereotypes and straw men. So
Okay,
if you say you've come across MRAs that want to go back to the 1950s, the first question I would ask is, how do you know they're MRAs?
okay, so according to you, MRAs, a genuine MRA wants equality.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
There are numerous people who have been labelled MRA or part of the men's rights movement who have nothing to do with us, and most of them we've spoken out against, saying, they're not part of our movement and have nothing to do with us. Like Elliot Roger, Rush
Mm.
V, oh God, what's his name?
I know that. I know.
Peter
Yes.
Nolan.
Yeah, I was
I
going to say the
mean,
guy who spells his name funny.
yeah, the copyright. He copyrighted
Yeah.
his name.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
lunatic.
Oh
But all
God.
these people have nothing to do with us, and they're most definitely not leaders because we've spoken out against them. Yet the media constantly claims that they're, your average representative or leaders in the movement, and it's really frustrating.
I don't want to get into a no true Scotsman Mare movement or argument here, but I will say, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, Bane. It's hard for me to
No, go
tell when
for
you're
it.
done. I will say, for my part, in my meanderings in the MRAO sphere, most men are more focused on changing their own roles in society and bettering themselves and bettering their position and unlearning things and approaching their life the way they want to. So they're very focused on self-empowerment, and they're very focused on, well, here's an inequity. What do we do about it? How do we talk about it? I don't see a lot of MRAs talking about what they think women's roles should be. In fact, Paul Elam, when there have been times that women, especially in his comments, have said, well, what are women supposed to do? And he's come forward and said, we don't want you to do anything. You just be you, but this is what we're going to do. So it's very focused on men having agency and doing for themselves. It is much less focused on what women should or shouldn't be doing. I have never been told as a woman in all of my time interacting with y'all, even before I was directly engaged, that this is how you should be acting. And even Karen Strawn, in some of her talks, if she's asked, well, how do we change feminism? You don't. You focus on yourself. And I think that's a healthier way to live.
Well, Karen,
is,
the most popular.
Cleaning your house.
Karen's the most popular MRA, and she's hardly the typical 1950s woman, is she?
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
She's very opinionated and outspoken, and yeah. But I remember actually there was an article written about me by some lunatic on the internet who claimed that MRAs want Mexican brides because they're docile. And I have no idea where this guy got that from. I'm guessing he maybe dreamt it one time or something. I don't know. But I searched the internet and couldn't even find pickup artists claiming that. It's just bizarre.
I've seen things like that in comment sections. Get yourself an Asian woman. Get yourself a Russian bride. But then I've also seen MRAs come back and say, guys, you're losing the plot here. This is not going to help you. You need to understand your own role in the world before you try and interact with any woman in a healthy relationship kind of way, if that's indeed even what you choose to do. So,
Diane, you want to jump in?
Along the lines of MGTOW, to be honest, I mean, I'm not claiming to be an expert on MRA. I mean, obviously, I'm still learning about what it's to some extent, but it's very much along the lines of that kind of separation.
Yeah, there is crossover between MGTOW and men's rights activism, but you can be one or the other. One is not necessarily the other.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a lot of disagreement between the two groups.
Mm.
So it's interesting, but the media likes to portray us in ways that we're not. In fact,
I was reading that on Twitter today. MRAs and MGTOWs and PUAs are all the same, and every time I see it, I need to take a shot every time that I see that happen, or give myself I die. I know.
You'd be drunk
you're
all
so
the time.
right.
Yeah.
It's like the SVU experiment. Don't ever do that. But no, they're quite different, and all the information that they're quite different. It's not like it's being hidden. It's right there, but it's much easier just to well, they're just those meninists, even though that doesn't even exist.
The article that I responded to on Witty Bitches, I left a comment in the comment section, and the author responded, and she basically said there's no difference between MRAs and pickup artists.
Oh, is that Frances Locke?
Yeah, and she then went on to say when MRAs stopped writing articles about how anorexic women are more attractive or something like that, then I'll take them serious. MRAs have never written articles like that. That's a pickup artist thing. So she's contradicted herself in the comment section. It was absolutely amazing to watch her backflip and jump around and trying to justify some of the things that she said and basically paint herself into a corner.
Mm. Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me to, I'm just saying my perspective, because what you find is that in England, I mean, even though you do have, lots of people subscribing from here to MGTOW sites and whatnot, what you find is that until very recently, men's activism or basically, lobbying and what have you on their behalf has tended to be very issue-based. You've had, Fathers for Justice, in terms of custodial rights. Now you have Calm for, male suicide rates and what have you. I don't think there's ever really been that kind of umbrella organization of, like the NOW. I don't think Britain's ever had that.
Well, I was just talking to someone about this in the comment section of a video yesterday, and I made the point that there are clear MRAs who, identify as MRAs and are interested in all the topics. And then there are people who aren't MRAs. They could be, anti MRA talking points, and they don't identify, and they've made it clear that they don't identify, like Rouge, for example. But then you have a grey area in between. For example, you could have a father's rights group. Now, they are obviously interested in a particular men's issue, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're interested in all the other issues.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They could actually be fighting against the other issues. They could be in favor of male circumcision, for example. And you could have it the other way. You could have someone who's a member of an intactivist group who is against fathers' rights. So these people are often lumped in with men's rights activists, and in some ways they kind of are, but they're kind of not at the same time, if you know what I mean. So I can
overlap,
understand,
but
I can understand someone maybe using someone in the grey area as an MRA, and I can definitely understand someone using someone who identifies as an MRA and who is, talking about all the issues. But what they do more often than not is use someone from the other group who actively says they're not an MRA and talks out against men's rights issues, like Rouge. They use them as an example of a typical MRA, and it's incredibly frustrating. Because, I'd like to spend more time talking about issues rather than putting out fires started by our opposition.
that's always going to be there, though, I think. And you just have to forge through it and keep going like you do. And but I think there is always going to be some reluctance to focus on men's issues, because I was just watching a video today. Well, what men's issues? You run everything. And then I'm just like, oh, no, not again, not again, not again. And because there's no nuance, there's no looking into things. And that's why I'm glad we're talking about the patriarchy. And we are still talking about the patriarchy. That's the point of this chat. We're going off on like you do. Well, yeah. But when you talk about patriarchy, it's such an accepted thing that, well, clearly men are in control and men run everything, and then you spin off into the whys, and that, to me, that is where it really starts to go off the rails, because it's when you start getting into assumptions of why did this happen? Did it happen because of environmental reasons, biological reasons, cultural reasons, religious reasons, or did it happen because men are toxic and are evil and they want to keep women down? And when you go with the latter, which many people do, then you can't have any conversations, because by default, out of the gate, you've got the white and the chess, or white and black on the chessboard already, and there's no room to discuss. And if you can't discuss, it's not going to change.
An interesting conversation I've had numerous times, the exact same conversation with some feminists, is that they'll make the claim men already have all their rights. And,
exactly.
And I'll point out the right to bodily integrity, which is a clear example, right, which they can't deny, because obviously circumcision is still illegal. And they'll come back and say, but women aren't doing that, or feminism isn't doing that. Well, but that wasn't the conversation. The conversation was what rights do men not have? And I gave you an example. But then it's dismissed because it's only an issue if one gender is doing it to another, as opposed to society doing it to a gender. And it's incredibly frustrating.
True, but then at the same time, I would ascribe part of the reason it's still around, and it doesn't. Part of the reason I think male circumcision is still legal is that it's because of the patriarchal idea that men are somehow more emotionally resilient than women, and it's something that we impose on boys. We see boys as being more resilient. That's why they can take cuts more easily than girls.
I think there's a lot of reasons why it's still around. Some religious, some cultural.
And the HIV. I mean, part of the reason I find it quite interesting because I myself am from a Nigerian background, and that's very, very pro male circumcision. It's got the highest rates of it of any country in Africa, something like over 90%. And you see, one of the many reasons why it's done is that it's said that inflicting pain on a child hardens them. You know, it makes them tougher and better prepared for the suffering of later life. Now, obviously, that is something in a lot of African families. You have that, you know, you teach both sexes that. It's part of the reason why FGM is so prevalent in Africa. Again, the pain toughens the girl. You know, she's more prepared for labor and childbirth in later life. She'll be tough. But then that idea of hardiness is something that you do see people imposing in boys, and you raise, you know, families do raise boys to do that in certain ways. Obviously, not necessarily via circumcision, but they do it in other ways. You know, you have the boys that cry, suck it up. The men are taken seriously with mental illness. There's different permutations of that, but you do see that idea.
But I wouldn't see that as an advantage. I mean, if we're living in a patriarchy, then it's a very strange. It's a very strange patriarchy.
I was just about to say.
Yeah, it tortures and deforms boys to make them harder. Yet that's somehow an advantage for men and boys. It's a very, very strange.
It's partly the result of a patriarchal idea that men are emotionally tougher than women. That boys are from the start.
But couldn't you argue that it's trying to make men and boys less emotional and tougher because of the roles which are instilled upon them as provider, protector? I mean, if you're expecting someone to go off into war and die to protect, you know, his wife and children at home, then you have to make them harder and tougher, don't you? But I wouldn't see that as a positive. If anything, patriarchy harms men more than women, the way you're describing it.
And I was just going to say, specifically with respect to genital mutilation, the assumption of patriarchy is that women are merely objects and receptacles for men's sexual gaze. Yeah. But then you have mothers getting their sons chopped, citing they think it looks better.
Yeah.
So who is subject to whose sexual gaze?
A good friend of mine whose sister is a fairly prominent feminist in the education system here. She got her son circumcised, to quote her, for his future wife, because basically she prefers the way it looks. So,
but then I think, again, at the same time, the thing about FGM primarily is that it's about reducing sexual pleasure, especially if you take the clitoridectomy. One of the reasons many tribes and groups do it is because they believe that, wrongly believe, the clitoris is responsible for sexual desire.
Yeah, so but that's the cause.
And Kellogg's said that boys should be circumcised to reduce masturbation as well.
Yeah.
And
so it's the same principle behind it.
Yes, but then at the same time, I don't think, to some extent, they're equivalent. I mean, I think either procedure is wrong, but then because of women's reproductive tissues being mainly internal, it's more likely to be fatal or cause, you know, severe injury in a woman. Not
if you compare female circumcision done in third world countries to male circumcision done in third world countries.
What? Because boys give birth.
No. Whenever you're cutting somebody with a piece of broken glass, you're going to get infected. Rule number one.
When you've got someone performing male circumcisions in unhygienic conditions using, you know, rusty, blunt instruments or a piece of glass or whatever, and they haven't had medical training, what you get is teenage boys dying every single year from infection.
Yes,
and not to mention the ones who have their penises amputated because of infection.
South Africa,
and what I find is that often circumcision performed in Western hospitals under, the best conditions, which is still bad, and you still get children dying. But that's compared to circumcision done in the third world on females, and that's an unfair comparison.
Yeah, but my point is that, but then part of the reason why I say this, because again, women's tissues are internal. That's partly why the fact is women are more likely, but also because of certain bodily processes. If you get the complications of FGM, you combine that with things like menstruation, the combination of blood clots, and also labour.
Well, I would consider having your penis amputated or death as a fairly serious complication.
I'm not sure it's useful to compare the morality or use of a particular practice by exactly how many people die from it. I think it's probably more useful simply to look at the basic ethic behind it. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But we can all agree that both are wrong, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So we should outlaw all of them, I think, all forms of circumcision.
Well, I would say except when it's medically necessary. If
Oh, yeah, of course.
Agreed. Of course.
Or when it's an adult over 18 choosing to have it done.
Yeah. That for me, that's the big thing. Medically necessary for a child, and yes, and routine circumcision definitely out. But when you can make that decision for yourself, sure. And if it is medically necessary, as it is in a small percentage of children, then definitely you do what's best for your kid. You don't hold to, you do what's best for your kid.
Mm.
But usually there's alternatives to circumcision.
Yeah, you got steroid creams and antibiotics, and a lot of it, as I've noticed, because of course I'm sort of 1 foot in healthcare. A lot of parents have been given really bad advice on how to care for foreskins in their infants, and that can result in a lot of problems, especially if they try and retract too young. And so a lot of the infections and tearing and scarring that can happen is because the parents simply don't know, and sometimes health providers don't know. Yeah, but they don't know that you can't pull it back. And if you go to a hospital and they need a clean catch urine sample, you don't need to pull the foreskin back. There are ways to do it where you don't have to do that. So it's just knowing how to deal with it. And if we lived in Finland or we lived in a culture where this was the norm, then everybody would know how to take care of a foreskin. But unfortunately, it's kind of hit or miss here. So.
And there's also the fact that in America, the doctors get a fairly sizable amount of money for a 5-minute procedure. So, there's motivation to get it done there. And also they sell the foreskins for beauty cream and things like that.
I don't know if we do that here in Canada. We have some pretty strict rules. Yeah, no, here in Canada, we have some pretty strict rules about stuff like that. But I could be wrong, and we might, in which case I will be even more horrified. Thank you, Bane. But, yeah.
But it's interesting that out of all the Western countries, America's the most pro-circumcision.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that's tradition and part of that's religion. But I'd also say there's economic motivation there as well. And that's definitely why the UN is pushing it into parts of Africa. They're trying to, the UN of all organizations are trying to increase male circumcision in Africa. And the people behind it are making a buck out of it. So,
well, I don't say it's thought to reduce the risk of men contracting HIV.
Yeah, but there's also studies in Africa which show that women who are circumcised are less likely to get HIV, and both of those studies are faulty as fuck. So
yeah,
you either accept both or you throw both out. I tend to throw both out.
Women, I don't think it's necessarily just because of the procedure. It's because of what it means socially. If you're cut, it means that you're a virgin or you're married. So you're less likely to be approached by men. That's the whole point of it. It's meant to.
And in the African trials where they circumcised adult men and then tested them, later on to see how many had contracted HIV. Basically, those men couldn't have sex for a certain amount of time because they were healing. So if you go months without having sex and you compare that person to somebody who was actively having sex for that same period of time, obviously the second one is more likely to get STDs.
Yeah, I would love to see more comprehensive studies done where they factor in things like lead time. I've read quite a few studies on STI prevention and how it relates to circumcision or not. And for me, it's a wash. When I volunteered in an HIV clinic, it did not matter. It really didn't. And I also think there's a danger in assuming, well, I'm cut, so I'm lower risk, so I can have more risky behavior. And that was actually cited in a study in my video on circumcision, where they found that men who were cut were more likely to engage in risky behavior, thinking that they were protected. And the recommendation was, no, don't focus on the circumcision, focus on general preventative behavior. So
Yeah.
it's like getting the Gardasil vaccine is great, but you still have to get them to wrap it up, ladies. You know.
Yeah, focus on using condoms. It's a lot safer.
Yeah, of course. And other things as well, like promoting male monogamy as well. I think that would help.
Yeah, but I mean, condoms I think is the easiest solution. They're cheap, they're much more effective than circumcision, and generally they don't result in penis mutilation, amputation, or death. If they do, you're using them wrong.
I was just gonna say they don't eat them. That's wrong. Wrong end. Oh no. Oh, we've gone off into silly town. Maybe it's just me. Okay. On such a serious topic too. Now I'm going to hell. Yeah.
I think we all are. Sorry. Anyway.
Oh, pardon me. Sorry. Normally I mute when I'm about to cough. I apologize.
That's all right. We've been going a fair while.
Yeah, almost 2 hours, I think.
Are we still happy to go for a little while longer, or?
I am in for the long haul.
Yeah.
Sorry, Diane. I think
for about 20 minutes. I'd say 20 minutes.
Okay. Well.
Okay.
Since we're going to wrap up soon, I didn't realize we'd been going so long.
Yeah.
Bunny, do you want to tell us why you went from being a feminist to a non-feminist?
Okay, short and sweet.
I'm sure Diane might have some questions to ask about that.
Or not, but she might, and that's fair. A bit of background on my introduction to feminism. My mother was a gender studies student, and so there was all the textbooks in my home, and I used to help her with her papers, and so I was very much marinated in it, and I'd always kind of accepted it as the way it was. I never thought, maybe this isn't the way it is. It's like when you're raised a certain way, you don't necessarily think that there's anything else. And then I got out of my house and into a fairly mixed environment. It was no longer this hard academic, queer stuff and blah, blah, blah stuff. It was a little bit of everybody. And I started to see cracks forming in some of the presumptions I had made. And patriarchy is one of them. Because patriarchy is, you read Ms. Magazine, it's patriarchy, 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 patriarchy. Everything is patriarchy. Here's a list of advertisements that are patriarchal, and we will tell you why this baking soda thing is patriarchal. We will tell you why this vacuum cleaner commercial is patriarchal, even though it has a man doing the vacuuming. And so it all started to unravel for me because I realized it was fly shit out of pepper at one point. It's so you could find it's like finding the picture of Jesus in the toast. If you're looking hard enough for it, you will see it everywhere. So I started to step back a bit, but I was still involved in the community, and I was still going to workshops, and I was still going to rallies, and I was still doing all that stuff. And then I got this niggle, though, right? Because every time I would say something like, well, guys, is this really fair to men? Is this fair? They would look at me like, what the fuck are you talking about? Why are you even bringing this up? Don't you understand? We don't care about them. This is about women. Why are you making everything about men? And I'm like, because they're human beings. I don't know. Like, because they're people. Okay. And I was quite cowed for a while when I was younger by it. I got quite a bit of backlash for it. The more I started to see and the more I started to say, well, we can't silence people. We can't not talk about this. Is this the way you want to go with this? And then there was the protests at Queen's University and University of Toronto, specifically Warren Farrell. And there was so much hate and animosity and violence, frankly. And I don't count violence necessarily in terms of these protesters hitting people, but I'm talking about social violence. I'm talking about disruption. I'm talking about basically making a giant arse of yourself, trying to prevent people from their God-given Canadian right. You can hear O'Cannon in the background as I talk. Their God-given Canadian right to see a speaker that they want to see.
Yeah, the cops were called in for that.
Oh my, it was
protest.
awful. It was awful. And that's when I started to go, and I was kind of at the end of it anyway by this point, because I'd actually been kicked out of 2 of my favorite social hobby groups for my anti-feminist views, even though I didn't think they were anti-feminist. I thought I was just being normal, just questioning. I just asked questions. I was kicked out of one because I observed that the men in the group were not being given, well, frankly, they were being given all the shit jobs and the women were getting all the good jobs. And some of them were telling me, I really would have liked to see a more fair distribution of the power here. And I said, well, can we not do this? And the response I got was, well, we've had thousands of years of patriarchy. It's time for a matriarchy, and we're going to start it here. And I was like, okay, I'm out. I am out. You are just as bad as the people you're speaking out against. I'm out. And the same thing happened with the queer community. It got so polemic and so knee-jerk, and you couldn't say anything about men that was good unless they were gay or trans. And then they kind of got a pass, right? You could not say anything about men having good points, or men maybe being right, or maybe they aren't our enemy, or maybe we should, think about what they're saying. And I washed my hands of them too. I'm like, you know what, guys, fuck off. I'm out. You are just as bad. And then I started figuring out my own path. In my heart of hearts, if you go by feminism as truly wanting equality and truly wanting men and women to get along and have a constructive society, then count me in the feminist camp. But what I am not is in the patriarchy, feminist, let's keep men down, let's ignore men, let's deride men camp. That is not the camp I am in. So as I've traveled more in the world, I have been gradually orbiting closer and closer to what would be determined an MRA. But I didn't set out to advocate for anybody's rights specifically. Even when I was a feminist, it was more about, is everybody happy? Is everything fair? Are we doing the best we can, or are we being shits? It was always about humans to me. And now, unfortunately, because I call things out when I see them, I am now in the MRA camp. But it's because that's the stuff that needs to be called out right now. If I would love for there to get to a point where there's nothing more for me to say. And then I just go back
I've
to.
I've often said that.
Yeah, and then I'll just go back to being me and keep bees or something.
Yeah,
but
I've often said I'd like to reach a point where I can just call myself an egalitarian.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And if our laws were favoring men over women in the same way that they're currently favoring women over men, I'd be speaking out against that too, because that would be just as shitty.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just where we are right now in the climate. So that's where I am.
Okay, you say that you've been, taken to task by feminist groups.
Mm-hmm.
Has there anything you said within MRA circles that you've that people have disagreed with, or that has been a source of dispute?
Within MRA circles, I don't think I have enough data. I don't have enough sample size yet because I'm really, really new. And a lot of what's been happening with me right now has been a lot of me shutting up and learning. So, because I tend to do that. Before I speak on something, I tend to lurk for a really long time. Before I started YouTube videos, I lurked for like a year, just learning and listening, and because I didn't want to make a total ass of myself. As it stands, I'm only a little bit of an ass of myself. So, I'm glad I took the time. But no, not especially. I think I've been gently questioned a few times on some of my own, perhaps more traditional tendencies. do you think that do you think that that traditional role is the way it should be? And I had to think about it, and I said, no, actually, I guess I don't. So yeah, I've been questioned. It's been really useful, though. It's been very gentle questioning. It hasn't been, you're wrong. It hasn't been, you're racist. When I've been questioned by this particular community, I haven't been called an ist at all. Whereas before, in the queer feminist circles that I was in, it was, that's a microaggression. You're racist. You're sexist. You're misogynist. There was no real actual argumentation. It was labeling, immediately dismissed. You've triggered me. You're hurting my feelings. You're ableist. And it shuts that kind of immediate knee-jerk reaction, just shuts all dialogue down. It's a debate terminating tactic. And while I haven't questioned here, I certainly haven't been there. I haven't received that same kind of you're an ist thing. Okay. Oh yeah, people disagree with me. Yeah. Oh yeah, but it's
disagreement's good though. I think disagreement's good.
Oh, but I welcome it. I keep my comment sections open, and I always say, if you want to take me to task for something I've said, do it. I've gotten into some good discussions in my comment section. But I haven't been shut down the same way, right?
And I think the men's rights movement's still fairly young, so I think we're still figuring out a lot of these things. Mm-hmm. So discussion's good, debate's good.
I mean, it's funny because, I find it quite interesting because obviously I'm someone that's questioned a lot about feminism, but for me, I don't find enough of those, I guess, unpleasant encounters and those differences as being enough to make me denounce feminism or, disavow calling myself one.
To be fair, Diane, you're not living in Canada.
Yeah. It is. And I would challenge you to do a thought experiment then with the circles you run in. What if patriarchy doesn't exist? Just as a thought experiment and see what happens, right?
Well, as I was just about to come to, is that I do argue a lot with feminists, ones that I know and I don't, sometimes, slanging matches and swearing and stuff. But then at the same time, I would still call myself that because feminist, because even if I give up the activism or mix in certain circles and whatnot, for me, it's about the core philosophy of equality. Some people don't believe it, some people do believe in the meaning of that's their choice. But I say for me, it hasn't deterred me yet, and I don't think it will.
Mm-hmm. Whereas for me, part of my giving up the label of feminism is because I think from a feminist perspective, equality has been achieved. So I no longer need to call myself that. It's no longer serving a real purpose. It's just anger. So, and that's my experience and my perspective. I know it's different from yours, but it's like I said, I'd stop calling myself an MRA if it wasn't needed anymore. I don't even really call myself an MRA now. I'm a bunny. I'm whatever. I'm not even a real badger. I'm a bunger. But by all means, if things went the way of women truly being trodden upon in ways that I could point to and quantify, and it wasn't just feelings and perceptions, then I might go back to, okay, we need feminism again. But right now, I don't see a purpose for it. So why would I call myself something that's not needed?
I have no issue with there being female rights advocacy groups. My problem is with patriarchy theory, the way it's often expressed, and all the things that go along with it. Usually it's, men dominating women, men oppressing women, and things like that. And you've been pretty reasonable, Diane. I obviously don't agree with you on everything, but you at least listen to us and and are willing to talk to us. So I'll give you full credit for that.
I love your hard line on abuse with kids, because it really pisses me off when that gets lost too. And it's not a bone for the jackals to fight over for their own platforms. It is what it is, and that is what needs to be addressed. So, and that really came out of me during the whole Duger scandal, right? And like a few years ago, anyway. But that really polemicized people into their partisan platforms. And my concern was, let's just figure out what happened. Let's just figure out what happened, guys. So I really like that. And I think you got a true eye there for what matters that way. So, yeah. I enjoyed the chat, Diane. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Likewise.
Cheers.
So I guess we should start wrapping it up then. Any last comments?
None from me.
No, I don't think so. I think this is the type of conversation that doesn't often happen on YouTube. And I hope that everyone listening sort of it turns around in their brain. I know I don't go into this trying to convince anybody of anything. I know what I believe. I want to hear what y'all believe. I want to hear why. And maybe my ship will shift a degree or two to the right or the left. But I think it's just important that other people hear people talking about this, and that way they can make their own mind up and get some more information. I would dare say most people listening to this will have learned at least one little piece of data from Diane, Bain, or myself. At least I hope so. That's the whole point of doing this. So,
well,
yeah.
what I find interesting about Diane is I think we probably agree on about 95% of things, but
I know, right?
That remaining 5%, it's the nuances of certain words and concepts. I think we just can't see eye to eye on. I think in some ways we kind of do, but I find that interesting.
And I don't think we need to see eye to eye on everything.
Oh, no, of course not.
Of course not. No, and that's not what you're saying. But I tend to agree. I agree with a lot of what's coming from your heart, Diane. It's just, again, so we have some language interpretation differences, and we've come to different conclusions. That's all. And yeah, so it was really good.
It's good to talk about that stuff.
Even though I was sick, and I apologize for not being my normal scintillating self. I had to keep muting to like gag into a bucket. I'm sorry.
A question to both of you before we go. Oh, sorry, alarm's going off. Are you both going to see the Red Pill when you can?
I definitely am. I don't know if it's going to come to Canada. It is. I can't see it being very well received here. It's men's rights here. It's funny because part of why I think Canada produces some of the most fierce and savage men's rights advocates is because of how it's viewed here, with such disdain and contempt. So I don't even know what's going to come here. But if it comes here, I will travel. And if, for example, if Honey Badger Radio does a Red Pill viewing thing, I will be on a plane like that day. So, and I will crash their house. I will knock. I will have a 6-pack of Guinness or whatever. And I will say, okay, I'm sitting on your couch. Where's the movie?
I think if there are going to be protests about it, I think it will be parts of Canada.
It will be. And it will be Toronto. If it comes to Toronto, it will be Toronto.
Yeah, just based on
because
past
we are
experience.
we are the festering we are the festering armpit of that kind of thing. So
because there haven't been any protests so far, but yeah, Toronto, I think, yeah, definitely. So are you going to see
people
it?
protest everything here?
You going to see it, Diane? Have you heard about the Red Pill?
Yes, I don't know how I will from Britain, but I will definitely look out for it. I've seen the trailer for it. I saw a talk and interview with the director as well, and of course Crystal, whom I interviewed, a snippet from her. So yeah, it's definitely something I would like to watch.
It should be available for download at some point, but I think they're going to do all the releases first. So I'm guessing you'll be able to download it maybe late November or something like that. I'm guessing.
Awesome.
I don't quote me on that. That's purely a guess. But yeah. So I think that will be an option for everyone. We should maybe get back together and do another chat once everyone's seen it. That might be interesting.
I agree, and I've actually had quite a few people suggest that to me. Get together and just have some brains come together and do like a viewing party stream for it. I think a lot of people are going to do that, but I think ours would be awesome. So, yeah.
And I do have a couple of other people that are interested in talking to you, Diane, if you want to do this again sometime in the future.
Okay.
All right, so we'll organise something there. And Bunny, I might be talking to you in in a month on the bar.
Okie dokie.
But that all depends if I can get that other special guest or not.
I don't mind being sloppy seconds. I don't take it personal. It's fine.
Well, I mean, anyone else, I'd put you first, but that I'm not going to say who it is.
I know.
But I think if you know who it is, but I think if everyone watching knew who it was, they'd understand why I'm putting that guest ahead of you.
Hey, the best things that have happened to me in YouTube have been like because I've been a last minute addition, so it's all good.
Well, you're only my second choice for that because of that particular person. Getting her in would be a big win, I think. So I have to talk to a couple of people and organise that.
Do it. Use your charms. Use your Kool-Aid charms.
Well, if not on the bar, I hope to get her on a one-to-one chat or something like that.
Sounds good.
But anyway, let's end it. So everyone say goodbye, and that's it.
Thank you again for having me, and thank you, listeners.
Bye, folks.
Yeah, thank you.